Greetings, comrades! All things chess, this is Cybertop back with you. We're continuing our examination of isolated pawns. We're finally going to look at a non-d4, d5 position. I know I've had a lot of that. I've had so many of them. I've never actually played the Queen's Gambit much with either side, but I've actually learned a lot about the theory. But I thought it was important to finally include some different structures, because it does matter for the specifics. But this will continue our examination of how to fight against the isolated pawn. I chose an example that includes the major pieces reaching sort of a theoretical best position to bombard the isolated pawn, which I thought was important to include for selections here. So we'll start up. This is Nikolai Padevsky against Padevsky-Hort. Padevsky-Hort, he was one of the best players. He never really seriously challenged for the World Championship, but he was one of the best players in the world from West Germany back in the 50s and 60s. Never really close to the throne, but he was always involved in the candidates, and he was a strong player. But he was black here, so d4, knight f6, c3, d5. So this is the Grunfeld defense. This is actually the opening I used to play when I was younger. When I was younger, I had a much more aggressive repertoire. I played one e4 as white. I played the knight orf and the Grunfeld. As I've gotten older and I've had less personal time in my hands, keeping up with that level of theory is impractical. Playing the Grunfeld at a high enough level, you're really spending a lot of time just tuning up your repertoire and keeping up on novelties. Because the Grunfeld leads to sharp enough positions that if you're off in your theory somehow or you play an inaccurate move, you're just dead out of the opening. So the Grunfeld is a perfectly sound opening. It just has so much theory attached to it that makes it impractical up to a certain level of play. But d5, cxd. The other mega main line is this. This was very popular with Botvinnik. When I was a kid, I went for a6 a lot. This was the Hungarian. This leads to the very sharpest positions. Couple other options. There's bishop g4. This leads to Smyslov. And then there's knight c6. This actually just came into vogue when I gave up the Grunfeld, but it's very interesting. Basically just very hyper-modern stuff. You know, the knights are going to peer out around and try to pressure the white center. But in the game, white takes on d5, which is probably the most principled move. Knight d, queen b3. This is an odd sideline. It's not the most critical move, but it's certainly not bad. Nowadays, white might play this to try to get away from the super mainline theory that you're forced to go into. The mega mainline, of course, is e4. And this is, white legitimately has 10 or 11 different options from here, all with a humongous amount of theory attached to it. To play this opening competently with black, you have to know all of these. And of course, white only has to know one, which makes it very impractical for black. Which is one reason I switched to the Nimzo Indian, but that's another subject. So queen b3, perfectly fine, just odd sideline. Knight b6, probably not the most accurate. I would play this. And this is basically just an exchange where the queen is on b3, where the queen on b3 really just doesn't belong there for an exchange variation. But knight b6 is a little bit compliant. 3. Queen c2. Queen a3 is the popular modern choice, and actually white scores incredibly well from here. This sort of shows the influence, or the change that modern chess has had. This game was played in 1968. No player really would have thought to play queen a3 in the 60s, because you're just putting your queen in that corner of the board. You're just marooning it off on a desert island some here. With modern eyes, especially with the influence of the computer, we see that as c5 is black's major pawn break. If black successfully achieves c5, his position is great. So the queen just contributes to the fight against c5. That's it. As long as white can tamp down on c5, he can continue to strengthen his center, develop his pieces, and start to strangle black. Queen a3 scores very well from here because it stops c5. That's really... Black's whole point is to attain c5, so white is willing to stop that with the silly-looking move queen a3. That's part of the joy of modern chess to me, that strange-looking moves like these have found a home. That they're seen as successful, even though they break every Tarashophilic rule you could possibly imagine. But queen c2 is the more normal-looking move, but it's not nearly as good. Knight c6, knight b4, and this is why another reason queen c2 really isn't as good, because it's losing even more time. Queen d1, castle, bishop e2. White needed to chase that knight away, and this is a dead equal position. Black's going to achieve c5 at a certain point, but white is neutralizing the Grunfeld bishop on g7, so this isn't so bad for either side. But bishop e2 allows the thematic Grunfeld move, c5. Basically, in the Grunfeld, whenever black can achieve this under favorable circumstances, he's at the very least equal, if not more. So castles, that is the best move. dxc5 would be a mistake, because after knight c4, just look at these minor pieces for black. Both the knights, both the bishops are just absolutely bombarding the white queen side. This is a dream position for black from the Grunfeld. White's temporarily up a pawn, but he's most certainly going to at least lose one pawn back, if not more. White would be very happy to lose only one pawn from here. So this is a fantastic position for black. Rook c8, after castle, rook c8, bishop e5. And now we get to our isolated pawn for the day. So this version of the isolated pawn is very favorable for black. So we've managed to get one set of minor pieces off the board. When you're fighting against an isolated queen pawn, it's always favorable to trade at least one or two sets of minor pieces away. Black has excellent control over d5. But notice he doesn't just have pieces idly sitting on d5. He's controlling it, but his minor pieces are still doing other things. Like the knight on b4 is actively controlling other squares. The downside for black is when he has a bunch of pieces sitting on d5 instead of doing other things. He's controlling d5, but his pieces are still active in other senses. So black has an edge in mobilization. That rook on c8 is very nicely placed. He has easy follow-ups like queen d6, rook d8, stuff like that, or another method that we see in the game. This is a dream position for black. White has managed to get rid of black's Fiend Shadow bishop, but that's not really a downside here. White still doesn't have a dark square bishop to take advantage of that, so we can't really call black's dark squares weak in any real sense, because white can't take advantage of it. So this is a dream position for black. He's definitely slightly better, and this is the sort of an edge that a good player can just milk forever. So we see some good technique here. Hort really was a fantastic player. Knight c6, he's looking to trade off white's only active minor piece. That's just good chess. Whenever you can, neutralize your opponent's strong pieces and leave your strong pieces on the board. Rook c6. So this is the start of the technique that I talked about at the beginning of the game. bx c6 is fine. Rook c6 is definitely more active. Bishop f3. Knight d5, not the most accurate. Rook d6 was a better chance, because after this... this is a favorable trade for black, because look at his control of the d-file. And he's going to mobilize even faster by hitting white's light square bishop. So after queen c1, knight c4, black's pieces are just completely swarming. Black has a huge edge in mobilization. He'll gain even more time. He'll be able to play moves like queen b6, hitting that bishop, and then bring the other rook into the game. Black's doing quite well, whereas knight d5, not bad, but it's not as active as it could have been. So bishop x d5, not the best. Queen d2, just holding serve is the best, but rook e1, e6, rook d6. So this is the classic procedure against the isolated queen pawn. And this is sort of the weird double-edged sword in trying to neutralize the isolated pawn. You want to trade some minor pieces off, but you typically want to keep major pieces on the board. And you want to keep them on the board for the sort of technique that we'll see from Hort in this game. You want to get your major pieces onto the d-file to bombard that weak pawn in the d-file. That's exactly why you want to keep the major pieces on the board. In the Rubinstein game we saw a few days ago, we saw Rubinstein keep major pieces on the board, but not for this tripling procedure. It was so he could fight for other parts of the board. But here we see the direct technique from Hort, which is very instructional. Queen f4, rook e8, we see a little bit of shifting. Rook e7, so he's just going to shift that rook right over to d7 and continue to attack. And there it is. So the term where your two rooks are in front and your queen's behind, that's called Ilyakin's gun. Ilyakin used this procedure against Nimzovich in a game 1930, I think it was San Remo, and it's been called that ever since. Doesn't really matter what it's called, but it's a typical procedure for bombarding something in an open file. Your queen's at the end of the train just because it's your most valuable piece, so you don't want it to be the first thing that gets traded off. Rook e d. So this is a very normal setup for an isolated pawn. when black does this. So basically all of white's major pieces are locked into defending the weakness, and all of black's major pieces are locked into attacking the weakness. Now the next part for white, or for black, it's that principle of two weaknesses that I've mentioned several times in our video series. It's not enough to have this d4 pawn as the only weakness on the board. If it's the only weakness on the board, white can just turtle up, defend that pawn, and nothing bad is going to happen. The next part for black is trying to create another weakness on another part of the board and trying to stretch white's defenses apart. So a6, he's going to march his queenside pawns up the board to create that weakness. h5, I give another line that'll be in the notes that you can look at, but this is fine. Rook g3, b5, b3. So this is the sort of weakness that we're looking for. It puts the pawns in the same color square as the bishop, which is a potential attack target for the bishop. It also generates an internal weakness on c3. So instead of that knight on c3 being defended by a pawn now, it's just loose. The rook on g3 has to defend it if it's attacked. That's a potential weakness that black can take advantage. So pushing the pawns on the queen side have already made a little bit of progress. Queen 7, just some general shifting maneuvering play. This is fine for both sides. Queen f6, so this is actually, it's a good time to trade. And this is part of the judgment call of playing against the isolated pawns. You typically want to keep the major pieces on, but you also want to find a good time to try to trade some material to keep going into a favorable ending. Here, the c-file is completely undefended, so it's a good time to get the queens off, because black can then either try to win the d-pawn or quickly occupy the c-file to make even more gains. So queen f6 is a good move from black. It's good timing. b4, controlling the c3 square. Taking a c6. This is a clear error, because it just gives black a clear tactical operation after this. He had to keep the c-file blocked up with rook c4. But after bishop x6, the clear threat is just bishop b5, hitting the knight on e2, because the knight is tied to defending that weak d-pawn. After bishop e5, that just removes the guardian of the d-pawn, and black's going to win something. King h7, this dodges the pin on the g-file. Queen e3, this gives up the h-pawn, but white's position is very difficult. After rook c5, black just executes his threat. He hits the loose knight on the e2, and he's going to win the d-pawn. And this really doesn't have a good retort. So queen e3, takes on h4, queen g4. So this is actually sort of surprising how much trouble black gets into, but he basically misplaces his queen. It sort of gets shut out of the game. Should just play queen d8, just get right back on target and attack that weak d-pawn. Black is just winning here. He's just going to convert his material, and white doesn't have enough material to break through on the king side. But after f3, rook c4, this is a mistaken turn. This brings up another subject for anyone, I would say 25 years and younger. We used to have these things called time controls. The old time control for 1968, if I remember right, you had 40 moves, or you had 2.5 hours for each side to make 40 moves. So around move 40, you can get into what's called time trouble. Then after the 40th move is passed for both sides, each side is, I think it was another hour that you got. When I came into chess in the 90s, you got 2 hours for 40 moves, and then an hour for the rest of the game after that 40th move. So we're on move 39 here. They probably would have been in time trouble at this point. So this sort of explains some of the suboptimal play that we're seeing. Rook c4, not optimal at all. Queen e5 is clearly the best move. It shatters the black stability on the king side. It takes up some very dangerous and useful squares, and looks to create some play. Can maybe prepare rook c7, but it also keeps e1 under control, so black doesn't have any checking mechanisms. So just an example of the play that white can get from here. King g8 is one of the better moves. If queen e7, this actually just flat out loses. Knight takes h5. Queen takes. And black has to take the rook in g5, otherwise he's just getting checkmated. So king g8 sort of steps out of that stuff, but then white can shatter black's pawn structure. And just to give one line quickly, and this leads to a perpetual check. Yeah, very surprising. And it's sort of a good example of how quickly things can fall apart if you're not technically sound. So queen e5 is the correct move, and it leads to a draw. Whereas after rook c4, this allows black some breathing room. So queen e7 is a technical mistake. a5 is best, just solidifying that b4 pawn. Now here, white doesn't actually have a kingside attack, but he actually has good compensation for the missing pawn. That knight on e5 is incredibly strong. The bishop on b7 is now sort of hitting on granites against the pawn on f3. And black's kingside dark square weaknesses are actually somewhat meaningful here. Bishop d5, tempo move. Knight x d7, this is the beginning of the end for white. This is incorrect. After rook c5, this holds serve. And it basically asks black how he's going to convert. And it's actually somewhat difficult to convert here, because black has that weakness in a5 to look after. Black also has weak kingside dark squares to look after. This is a tough position for black. Now, I think black can slowly make progress, but this isn't a given at all. But after knight x d7, material comes off the board. Knight b6 was better here, but after knight c5, now black is very easily making progress. With the rooks off the board, black doesn't have to worry about a mating attack. So he has a lot more freedom to suddenly push these kingside pawns forward. So now we're in the realm of technically converting this position. I'm going to give far less comments here, but I'll just quickly play through the moves because I think they are interesting. But this is far afield from our isolated queen pawn examination. So g5 is better here, just taking away the f4 square. And this is a queen and pawn ending. Queen and pawn endings, in my opinion, are the most complicated because they're the most calculation intensive. The most important feature in a queen and pawn ending is king's safety. These sort of endings, you can be completely winning, make one error, and all of a sudden a perpetual check drops out of nowhere, just because if your king isn't safe, it's vulnerable to those sort of checking mechanisms. So you have to balance pushing your pawns versus king safety and controlling the checking squares, it's just pure calculation. If you're good at a queen and pawn ending, in my opinion, you can basically be good at any ending, because most all endings are just pure calculation. G5, just pushing the pawns. And notice how the black king is still perfectly well shielded by them. H3, breaking through white's pawn cover. H2. Notice that it's not too late for black to screw up. One move is all it takes. And then all of a sudden, white breaks through to the underbelly and black gets a perpetual check. But black maintains control properly. King f7, this is a little bit inaccurate. G4. And because the queen is controlling the h6 square, this is perfectly sound from black. So, just go through the rest of the moves quickly. A little bit inaccurate. I give it another line in the notes, but you can check that out. And white finally resigns here, because losing that pawn is more than enough for black. So really the key to this position was... this is really what I want you to take away from this video, this structure in this setup against the isolated queen pawn. This idea of getting your major pieces on the open d-file against the isolated pawn. This is a very common procedure in these positions, and it's really why, when fighting the isolated pawn, you want to trade minor pieces off, but you typically want to keep major pieces on the board, because you want to get those major pieces involved in the fight against the isolated pawn. The minor pieces are really what drive the isolated queen pawn's activity. Once the minor pieces are gone, you've got room to line up your major pieces to attack the weakness. So this sort of position here is very, very common against the isolated pawn when something's gone wrong for the isolated pawn. The major pieces are all lined up against the weakness, and then you get your pawns moving another part of the board to try to generate a weakness on that side of the board. The weakness of the isolated pawn typically isn't enough. You want to generate another weakness to try to stretch the defending side's defenses apart. So, excellent technique from Horst. As usual, I'll give the PGN file and notes so you can look over that. Next game, we're going to look over kingside defense. The endgames that we looked at are sort of idealized, where the isolated pawn doesn't really attack properly. The next few games are going to be looking at how to defend your kingside when the isolated queen pawn does get an attack going. Because your opponent's not always going to be so compliant, so it's important to know defensive techniques against the typical IQP attacking plans. So My name is John. I'll see you then.